I would like to first give a little bio for Kathy Flynn. Do you go by Katie or
Kathy mostly.
Kathy. Kathy grew up in Portales, New Mexico. She then went to University of Utah, got a bachelor's in education. Then went to Southern Illinois University and got her master's in psychology and rehabilitation. She began working in New Mexico state government in 1966 for 27 years. Held the following positions. She worked for the health department, community mental health consultant, and then director of the New Mexico Crippled Children's Services, now Children's Medical Services, for 10 years. Carrie Tingley Hospital, assistant administrator. Deputy Secretary of State, 1991 and 1998. While there, she compiled and edited 9 editions of the New Mexico Blue Book. Other things she's done to take a break, I know she worked at Fenn Gallery, office manager and accounts receivable. She was director of Parents Anonymous counseling program, Santa Fe, New Mexican columnist and a radio talk show hostess, author of 3 books, a lobbyist, teacher, and then since 1998, she was the founder and is the executive director of the National New Deal Preservation Association, also a board member of the Historical Society of New Mexico, and an Honor 2012 designated as one of the 10 Santa Feans who made a difference. And how I met Kathy, I was manager on duty, I think it was one Sunday, several months ago, and she was up on the table in the sales area, her and some of her family that were from out of town, and I just, like I do, I don't know, I have this thing inside me, I just like to go talk to people. And I just ended up starting talking to them, and then she said, oh, this is what I do, and she told me about New Deal. And of course, right away, it's like, hey, would you like to come talk to our docents one time? I'm always working on our future presentations. And she said, absolutely. So with that, she's going to just do a very informal, no audio visual, which is fine. So I would like to introduce Kathy Flynn.
Thank you. I don't know about the rest of you, but the juniper pollen level this morning is 371, and I don't normally sound like this, and I don't normally cough all the time, but hopefully some of you will appreciate it because you're probably suffering with the same situation. I was delighted to know and hear that there was a docent group here at La Fonda, and to meet Ed because of his enthusiasm, of course. So you've got a deal here, I think. Of course, coming here in the 66, I immediately discovered the La Fonda and all the wonderful things in it. Over time, I got to certainly know the family that had the hotel. And Sam once asked me to come and meet with some of his friends in the kitchen. And I thought, man, I must be really in if I just get to sit in the kitchen and eat with the guys, kind of thing. So that was a wonderful experience to remember about the La Fonda. There are 3 or 4 New Deal artists that did work here not for the New Deal, but for La Fonda. And I suspect that you all know already about all the art that's in this building, because I understand you have a training manual, and I want a copy of it so that I can learn more too. But they did not work. The New Deal, let's see. I always say if the people have the same color hair or no hair, they may have heard in the New Deal. They may have even had somebody who lived in it and worked in it. So, get a show of hands. How many people know what the New Deal is or was? Great, that's a good percentage. How many may have had a family member in the WPA or the CCC or the NYA? Those were some of the popular programs. Good, excellent. I want to know, there's a piece of paper on the last piece of paper, I think, on your handout. I want you to fill in and give me information about what you knew about the New Deal, who your person was, and if I'm forgetting which questionnaire I put on the back, just scribble off some notes to me, because we're always looking for people that were in one of those programs so that we can thank them and honor them. And we have something coming up in June that I'll just share about briefly, because we're really hustling to see what we can find. We want to give out our first preservation awards, but we're also bringing in a bunch of grandchildren. One of them is one of Franklin and Eleanor's granddaughters. She's coming in. And then we have grandsons of 5 or 6 other people whose fathers or mothers were part of FDR's cabinet. So Frances Perkins, who was the Secretary of Labor and the only cabinet woman, the first day that cabinet got organized, all those men looked at her and said, "And what are we supposed to call you?" She said, "You will call me Madam Perkins." And so she was always known as Madam Perkins. And she always wore a very specific kind of hat. She must have been quite a character. She told Roosevelt she wouldn't come unless he let her get together Social Security and make that happen. She was very much involved with labor. She was also considered like the grandmother of the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. In New Mexico, we had some 56,000 boys that were in the CCC. And that meant that they had to be 17. They had to weigh at least 107 pounds. They had to be about at least 5 feet 5. They had to have a family that was destitute. Everybody was. They couldn't have any venereal diseases. And they had to have at least 3 good masticating teeth, one up and one down. Does that tell you about the public health conditions during the 30s and 40s? So many of them, 3 million of them got hired nationwide. 66,000 were here in New Mexico. And some of them were from other states. And some of them got to know some of our New Mexico girls. And most of the CCC guys, after it ended in 42, because of what? Does anybody remember what happened in 42? Pearl Harbor, World War II. Those guys went directly into the war, but a bunch of those guys migrated back to Santa Fe and all the little towns in New Mexico where they worked and married with some of those girls and raised families and became strong New Mexicans because they were really taken by this state like we are. The other thing that was critical and why very interesting about that program was they got paid $1 a day. That was $30 a month. They only got 5 of that money because the other 25, you remember, got back to the family. And that was great for those families to get that $25 to feed the rest of the family. So, you know, some of those guys, with their parents' support and help, lied about their ages and got in a little early. So some of the ones that are still around are just now hitting, they're pushing 100. 2 of them I know are 100. One of them was Tony Reyna, a former Taos governor, and a fellow down in Albuquerque. So those families were very, very happy to have their sons go into the CCC. And there were so many of them, and they were known by Roosevelt as his tree army because they planted billions of trees, billions, all over this nation. And maybe you don't know, but Franklin Roosevelt was a tree farmer in the Hyde Park, New York area. And if you ever go to his presidential library, you'll notice that there are a lot of trees around that part of the country. So he saw that as a way, well, when he took office, he had all of these people in the United States that were out of work. So he had to put people to work. So they came up with programs for artists, they came up with programs for writers, they came up with programs for architects, they came up with programs for laborers, they came up with programs for musicians, everything. And then they had all these kids. You know, what do we do with all these young people? And at this point, the folks had said, we can't feed you, you go out and find a job. They might have been 15, 16, whatever. So they were riding the rails, looking for jobs in other towns. So they came up with this idea, Francis Perkins and FDR, of the idea of the Civilian Conservation Corps. And that's what took care of all those boys that were, quote, riding the rails. The camps that they were in were run by the Army, and I talked to many and many, many of those boys. And they've all said it was the most important thing that ever happened in their lives, because the fact that they got all this training, they got to see the world. Some of them stayed home for the most part, but most of them were out in the other places they would never have seen anyway before. They also said it was neat. I got my own bed. I didn't have to sleep with my brothers and sisters. And they had new clothes. Well, not new clothes. Some of them were World War I wool uniforms. And some of them were kind of bigger around the waist. So they also gave them ropes to tie them up to hold them on hold their pants up. And so they just thought it was a pretty damn good job to get into. Most of them did go into the Army, had all kinds of jobs. There were generals that said, we won the war on the backs of those CCC boys, because they were already trained not to shoot, but to drive the trucks, take care of the kitchen, do all the manual stuff that had to be done to keep the troops moving around and all. One of them was very early on in the formation of our group here in New Mexico. And I said, what did you do? He was down in Berlin. I said, what did you do when you were in the CCC? Oh, he said, I strung the telephone lines across the Grand Canyon. And he ended up, after he came out of the military, being an offshore oil driller. I said, my God, you like to live on the danger line, right? Don't you? And boy, he loved to talk about the CCC. That was just one of the programs, and it involves so many people. That's why I always bring it up, because there are sometimes people in the audience who will remember that their family member was in the CCC. Although these people don't always talk about it. Likewise, if they were in the WPA and they were laborers, they don't talk about it, because if you were in the WPA, Works Projects Administration, it also had the name Works Progress Administration, so don't get in an argument with somebody, you'll both be right. They had to first be on relief or on welfare. So some people didn't talk about it. But a lot of our artists in New Mexico were WPA artists, which meant they had to be on welfare first. But they were starving. Who had money to pay for art? The artists didn't have any way of selling their stuff. So this was a godsend to them. The same with musicians. We had a musical program in New Mexico. The writers, we had a really big writers project, and all those records are at the History Museum, the Fray Angelico Chavez, in the old onion skin carbon copies of all the stories they wrote up. They hired people, writers or would-be writers, to travel around the state. They hired people in various parts of the state, and they hired them to write about what their area of the state looked like, what were the things that were significant. And they wrote a book called the State Guidebook of New Mexico. There's a state guidebook for every state. There's a state guidebook for all big towns, Washington, D.C., Dallas, Fort Worth, Chicago, San Francisco. So that's how they put the writers together and what they did. And they turned out lots of other books besides the guidebooks. So there's all kinds of things you can find that was done during that time. In New Mexico, we did something that was very unique. The woman who was in charge of the music project was wanting to capture the music of the different ethnic groups of New Mexico, so what she did was take the writers and then had them write about musical, primarily Spanish folk songs. They had the musicians compiled the music, and then she had one artist, Gisela Leffler from Taos, who was not Indian, she was Austrian, and she illustrated that book. So we had the three groups involved in one publication, and I have a copy of it and hold it dearly, and it's a children's music book that was used in the schools. And the music program nationally was something that was run by a symphony orchestra conductor, Nikolai Sokolov, and he wanted musical symphonies all over the nation. And they did create about a dozen symphonies all over the country. But this backward state of New Mexico, they didn't create one because we already had a symphony in New Mexico. The Albuquerque Symphony already existed in the 30s. So that's why she selected, the music director, this opportunity of capturing the music of the different ethnic groups of the state. So that was a real coup. And after he left, the person who followed him decided that maybe she had a good idea, along with the directors in Arizona and some of the ones far away from Washington, D.C. And so then they started putting their emphasis on ethnic music. And so that was something that came out of the music program. I will just mention one little tiny thing that there were still some kids around that didn't get into the CCC, and they were still home. So they developed a program for them, and that was called the National Youth Administration. So that was the NYA. And there's a woman up in Clayton once that I interviewed that said, you know, I played the piano for the chorus teacher in high school, and consequently, I got $5 a month. Consequently, I was able to buy myself a graduation dress at the end of the year. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had a new dress for graduation. So she said that was really important to her. There were all kinds of programs, but I just wanted to give you an overview. In New Mexico, we had in the 1930s, 435,000 people all over the state. By 1935, half of the whole state were on one of the New Deal programs, all over the state. The heaviest concentration was in the northeast corner, Clayton, and right up in there where all the Okies and Texans were coming over to get out of the Dust Bowl on their way to California for jobs, and certainly some of them stayed. The lack of any activity was down in the southeast portion of the state. There's very little around Jal and Eunice, but there is some things in Clovis, Portales. Alamogordo, there's a little thing out there called the White Sands. And that is a national park, and the CCC guys built all the buildings they have and all the trails, and the WPA guys helped to build the furniture and the tin work and the chandeliers and the light sconces and whatnot for that visitor center, the Carlsbad Caverns Center, the Bandelier Center. The Bandelier story is great too. Those fellows have shared with me a lot about that. All of you have been probably to Bandelier, and you know that road that goes deep down into the valley. How did they get down there? Well, they had these big trucks, and they had learned a lot about mechanics. So they just dismantled the trucks and tied a piece of rope around every piece and lowered it down into the bottom, and then got down there and reassembled the trucks and built a road out so that then they could bring things in and out to build 35 buildings down there and all of the roads and trails and things at Bandelier. Then they brought in some artists, a Pablita Velarde. Has anybody ever heard of Pablita? Pablita loved that because she got to go there, and she actually even got to take her kids with her part of the time. She got paid $5 a day, and she did 37 paintings, watercolors primarily, of scenes of her pueblo, Santa Clara. And oh, did she get in trouble for doing that with the elders of the Pueblo. She didn't care. She said, what the heck? She said, I was able to build my own house with all that money and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know how she got away with it, but she was a pretty strong-willed lady. And so she did make a lot more money than the CCC guys did. She loved to talk about, I made more money than those guys did. Helmuth Naumer also did some artwork down there. There's some pastels. Also, they have some of these on display from time to time. Otherwise, they're in their storage and areas. So all the parks in the state, both national and state parks, had work done by the CCC or the WPA. God did a lot, of course, to have them start with, but then our CCC and New Deal folks made it then accessible for the rest of us to enjoy today. And so back in '98, I was the Deputy Secretary of State, and with Stephanie Gonzalez, who was the secretary. First day on the job, she said, Kathy, you'll be responsible for compiling and editing the New Mexico Blue Book. What's that? You know, my husband, who was a historian, I remember it had all these blue books up on top of a shelf, way up high. And it is a book that is a reference book on just about anything you want to know about New Mexico. Well, it talks about, it started out as a government publication, and it still is a government publication. It comes out every 2 years. But it talks about the history of New Mexico, the executive branch, the legislative branch, the education branch, all the different components. And then it's, all the Chamber of Commerce, all the radio stations, all the museums, all the. I went, oh my gosh, that's going to be quite a piece of work to do. And after I got into it, I thought, okay, there's all these different sections. What am I going to do to, what are the divider pages to break up the sections? And I was talking to somebody, and they said, oh, why don't you do pictures of murals? And this big mural flashed up in my head, and I went, my gosh, what is that? Where is it? Why do I know about it? And I remembered, it's in Portales. It's at Eastern New Mexico University. It's in the administration building. It's on all the walls going up to the stairwell. I have sung in choral groups on that stairwell. How come it's there? Well, to begin with, it's a New Deal building. There are 2 buildings on that campus that are New Deal. And they had money, from the state had money, to hire an artist, namely a guy from Santa Fe named Lloyd Moylan, to work on this mural, but they didn't have any money for paint. So they set out to find somebody or some group that would pay it. And they found somebody, and I've never known who, gave them $160 for all the paint, provided they got to choose the subject and that the man did not paint on Sunday. Being a preacher's kid from Portales, I understand that would have been an awful sin. Anyway, the subject they chose was Ecclesiastes 12 from the Bible. So in a state building, we have a religious mural, and it is an excellent mural. He also got caught painting on Sunday, and supposedly the preachers came on Monday, and his response was, what better day to paint the Lord's word than on the Lord's day? So he got away with it. As a result of that, I started looking around to see what other murals existed, what other buildings existed. And I've done 9 editions of the Blue Books since then. And the first one, I featured murals. The second one, I featured New Deal paintings. The third one, I featured New Deal buildings, but primarily courthouses, because at that point in time, Stephanie said, I want courthouses. I told you I want courthouses. I said, yeah, but it's so boring. They all look alike. Well, they all look alike because they're all New Deal. except that's primarily on the east side of the state. We've got some others that don't look like it. So we did the courthouses. And then I did women of New Mexico. And then I did ethnic groups of New Mexico. And then I did various seeds. But anyway, it's a good book. You can get them at the Secretary of State's office. I think they're probably charging $12 for them. They just finished a copy or another edition 2 or 3 months ago. And it's extra big because they waited a year, so now that they've got the legislators' pictures that were in 2 sessions back and the ones that are currently in, so you have all of them that were in there. At the end of that, by the time I got doing this, I started not just looking at New Mexico. I thought, well, if it's in New Mexico, what about the rest of the country? And so I started calling people, primarily secretaries of state, since I was calling on state time. And then I got, shooting out to historical societies and whatever. And I found people all over the country that were interested. And so towards the end in 1998, before we were leaving office, I got some money together, and a number of those people came to Santa Fe, and we sat down together for 3 days and talked about what all was out there that we knew about, and decided something has to be done because some of these things are being destroyed, are being lost. People don't know about them. They don't see them. There are places that you go to a lot, but you don't go there to look at art. Like, who goes to the courthouse to look at art? Who goes to, a school or a university to look at art? Or a post office? There are in hundreds of post offices in this country. So we formed an organization. The guy who was the group facilitator, the group decided should become the president of the organization. And they said, Kathy, what are you going to do next week when you're out of a job? I don't know. I haven't, I'm going to retire. Ha! They said, well, you could be the executive director. That was in '98. And I'm still the executive director. I'm now getting a salary. I get $200 a month. I didn't for a long time. But I love it. I love it. And I have written one book called The Treasures on New Mexico Trails about everything I found. And that was 43 towns. And since I've done this one, which is an edition, next edition of it, I have one on every, and there are more if you need them. But we're going to look at some things in here. But this has got 90 New Mexico towns, tells you what's in every town. It has 170 bios, including the bios on the people here that I'm going to talk about. And then I also did this one. This is the New Deal book, which tells about the different programs and the stories about some of them. And I would just like to share, many of you may have seen this picture of the migrant mother, which was taken by Dorothea Lange. That was another one of the programs, Farm Security Administration, and it put a lot of people who were photographers to work. Dorothea Lange became the most prominent and well-known. John Collier, Jr., was one of them also from Taos area. I was really fortunate. He has 2 sons still in Taos and another son in San Francisco, and we had him come out and do a program in Taos at the Rural Electric Association building, another New Deal program that's still with us today. And he showed some of the pictures his father had done, and just about everyone in the audience was in one of those pictures. There was one little girl in one of the pictures, and that was Sarah back on the back row, and Sarah was probably 50 years old and stood up, and it was like everybody came to see the family portfolio. It was wonderful, and he did a great job. So I got onto this, and I got hooked. And I started trying to find out who the artists were and why they were here. You know that many of them came because of tuberculosis. The architects, same. John Galmeen, tuberculosis. Clyde Tingley, the governor at the time, his wife, tuberculosis. There were many reasons, but certainly there were already a lot of artists here because of the light, this wonderful place. And then there were other artists sent out to New Mexico because they maybe had a glut on some part of the country and they moved them out to New Mexico. One of the things that the Federal Art Project did was create 4 art centers, 4 federal art centers. And that was a place where they gave art classes, they put on art exhibits, including local art, but also they sent out artwork from Washington on an exhibit going around the country to these federal art centers. Anybody know where our art centers were? It was not in Santa Fe. Melrose, Gallup, Las Vegas, and Roswell. Roswell is still in existence, has never closed its doors. You may have been there. It's the Roswell Art Museum and Science Center. As you're coming into town, it's one of the first things on the right when you feel like you're finally into Roswell. It's a big adobe building. The WPA guys did a lot of work on the CCC guys did a lot of work on the acequia behind it, all the streets and the roads in the area. But that art center is still in existence, and I have gotten to talk to one of the second director, who was a young man from this part of the country, or this part of the state, and he was working in Albuquerque at the library and got sent down there, and he said, my board of directors had Peter Hurd, and he named off a bunch of people that, Robert O. Anderson, and all these kinds of names that he said, I was scared to death. I didn't know what I was getting into. But he made sure that the city got involved in that, and that's one of the reasons why it's still with us today. I was once in Chicago, and I was, where there's a lot of New Deal stuff, and I was at one of their art centers that was a federal art center. And they said, and we are the only federal art center that has never closed its doors. And I went, I'm sorry, but there is another one, and it's in Roswell, New Mexico. And that woman was so disappointed. But I was thrilled to be able to share that with them. So the others closed for a variety of reasons, but they did. And when World War II started, there were a number of these art pieces floating around. And as an end result, there's a collection of artwork at the University of New Mexico. And on 3x5 cards, there's names of who did them and what the name is and what the medium is. And it's not anybody they've ever heard of before. And we sat down and talked about it a number of years ago and decided that had to be some that was in a traveling exhibit, and they got told wherever they were, you keep them. We don't have the money or the time to get them back to Washington because we got to start building bombs and things like that. The art graphics program was the only one that lasted after World War II. And some of you may remember some of the things they did. Did you ever see posters that said, buy U.S. war bonds? Or did you do it? I did. I saved up money to get a $25 war bond when I was a kid. And then there was join the Navy, join the Army, join the Coast Guard. So they lasted into about 45, whereas the other things stopped in 43. So we're talking about 33 to 43. So that gives you a basic overview. You can go to post offices, courthouses, libraries, all kinds of things, and see these kinds of buildings. Or if you get used to it, you can pick them out, just like that, because they look similar. What do we have here in New Mexico, or even here in Santa Fe? I would like for you to open up to what page? Santa Fe is on page, and if you'll share, and I've got a few more. Let's take these, and if you want to share. And, okay, Santa Fe is on, oh, which page do I want it? It's going to be at the front of the book. So 115. Yes, turn to 115. I'm just going to whip through these fast, but so that you can see what buildings are here. And if they have artwork in them, you scoot over there or look at it over somebody's shoulder. The deaf school, there is one building still standing there. And then they've got 3 paintings in the superintendent's office, her house, and then there are 2 murals in the cafeteria done by a woman named Edma, not Edna, Edma Pierce. And we are working with them. We may be doing some restoration work on those. And this is a good time to tell you, if I didn't tell you at the very beginning, I want you, as a result of my talk, to become New Deal detectives, and I want you to gossip a lot about the New Deal. So your first detective job would be to see if anybody has ever heard of Edma Pierce before, and if they have any artwork by Edma, because we have not found anything about Edma except that particular place where she did some work. Supreme Court building, which you see all the time, that was a New Deal building. You might be interested to know that a lot of the floors are made with cork so that it would be quieter there. But then when women started working there and they had on high heels, of course, we don't wear high heels that much anymore, then they would beat up the cork, and so they had to replace, and found it was very expensive to replace cork floors. So anyway, there is artwork in the Supreme Court building. My favorite building, of course, is the old Santa Fe Trail building off on the old Santa Fe Trail, which is the National Park Service regional. It was their regional office building for many years. It is established as a National Historic Landmark, but we as a group with other historical groups, it's right beyond Museum Hill. We want to make that a historic site, which would make it comparable to a state park, a national park. And we're fighting that, trying to get Obama to do something about it before he leaves. But, and this, of course, is a picture of the building. There is a lot of furniture and a lot of art there. The Fra Angelico Chavez History Library, the public library, used to be the city hall and the fire station, and has 2 little statues, not little, they stand up about this tall. One of them is boy and one of them is girl, done by Hannah Mecklem Small Ludens. And she got those rocks from Las Vegas and carved those. They also have a copy of the Portfolio of Spanish Colonial Design, and that is this. It's not this book. This book is a book about it. It's a big portfolio with artwork that was done, and I can tell you more about that in a few minutes. I want to whip through these and then talk about the 3 or 4 artists here.
Aren't there 2 Cassidys in the main post office, federal building downtown?
Yes, there are. It's so nice that you ask. I was going to share that when I was talking about Cassidy, but now that you've brought it up, because it's such an interesting story, and I've got to have a sip of water. Gerald Cassidy was born Ira Diamond Cassidy, and he came to New Mexico. Let's see, I've checked there's 170 bios in the back of these books. Of course, these books are for sale if you want to buy one, and if you damage one, you got to buy it. He was born in 1879 and died in 1934, and his death was the result of the New Deal. He came out here, he was born in Kentucky, and then worked in Cincinnati, got his first prize in art when he was 12 years old. And he became a commercial artist, working in New York and New Jersey. Now, all of this before he was 17, because he got out here at 17. And then when he got here, he changed his name to Gerald. And if you notice, because I think this is one of his, there is his name, and there's a G, a C, and a circle around it. And he said that was to make it look, he used the O kind of thing, which was like a kiva, the image of the kiva, the Zia symbol. And so he wanted to combine that with his family name, which was O. Cassidy. So that was his logo. And so he did some paintings here in the La Fonda Hotel, which you all know about. There are some in a couple of other places, but those two that you were talking about were not New Deal because they were done in 1929 for the Oñate Theater. Anybody know where the Oñate Theater was in Santa Fe? Where? The First National Bank building, all right? And I don't know, the owner was John Hardin from Oklahoma City. He must have sold that building to probably a New Mexico person. And so he took his murals with him and went to Acapulco. And he put them up in one of his buildings in Acapulco. And I don't know whether he sold that building or whatever it was. And he took his murals again. These are oil on canvas glued to a wall. Then he took them to Hobbs. And he had them there in Hobbs. And in 1948, he decided they should come back to Santa Fe and they should be put in the state capitol. That was before the Roundhouse. That didn't happen. They were put in storage by the State Fine Arts Museum, or somebody, but I think it was Fine Arts. And in 1962, the post office started building the main post office building. And I don't know who made these connections, but the bottom line, the state sold those two murals to the feds for $1 a piece. And you go to the post office, you never see them because you go into the post office area. You don't go into the lobby. You bloody well better go into the lobby now and see those two because they are magnificent paintings. One is the Spanish coming over the mountain in all of their armor and ready to go. And then the other one's over here, and it's the Indians coming over the mountain, and they're ready to go. And so you shouldn't miss them. As I recall, the Native American in the forefront of that left one on the left is painted is Julian Martinez, Maria Martinez's husband. Or it's an image of him, not him standing there. He died a long time ago. But that's an example of what has happened to a lot of the artwork from the New Deal. It's either been moved around, or it's been destroyed, or it's been painted over. And we have spent $550,000 as our organization trying to fix some of those that have been painted over or that have been messed up badly in various ways. So Cassidy was one of the guys. And then after he did that, he got a job for the WPA to do a mural for St. Francis Auditorium. And if anybody's heard my speaks before, Marion, I probably have said that he got a job to do something in the federal courthouse. I was wrong. I reread my book last night, and it was St. Francis Auditorium. So he rented a warehouse here in town and scaffolding and started working on this big mural that he was going to do for St. Francis Auditorium. Kept getting sick. He'd go home and he'd get better. Came back to work and he'd get sick again. And bottom line, he died of carbon monoxide poisoning at 55 because the building was poorly or inadequately set up. And his wife, who was the head of the Federal Writers Project, said that her husband gave his life for the WPA. She was off because it was a different program, but anyway, it didn't matter. So she became or she was the head of the Federal Writers Project. And working with her was William Pinallo Henderson's wife. And later, when she left, then Mrs. Henderson moved up as the director. I bring up Henderson because if you go to the post office, then you should go to the federal courthouse and look at the 6 Henderson murals on the first floor. Now, you will have to go through security. You can't, have any metal on, all this kind of stuff. You can't take a phone in, all this stuff, so leave everything in the car. And say hello to one of the guards, because that's that's Mr. Susanna Martinez, referred to as the first dude. Anyway, there are 6 fabulous murals in the federal courthouse. If you've never been in that building, go see it. While you're in there, go up this beautiful staircase, spiral staircase, and up on the 3rd floor are 3 paintings by Warren Rollins. And they were in the Gallup post office at one time, and when they closed that building, they moved them away, and then they decided to bring them to Santa Fe. They being one of our chief justices, a female whose name I can't call up right now, and she wanted to have some Indian paintings up there on the floor in the lobby going into the courtroom, because she said we have a number of Native American cases from time to time, and I'm sure that it's a difficult thing for people to come here, and it's out of their area, and they want, it would be nice to have some Indian paintings so they would feel more comfortable going through that day. So there are those 3 Native American paintings there upstairs, so don't miss them either. I just look through this because the state capitol building, I would be happy to give you all a tour of that. If you're like a lot of people in our hometown, you don't go see something like the state capitol, even though it's just dead down the street. We do have 3 or 4 New Deal paintings in there. One of them is a mural about that size. Well, let's say it's a little skinnier, and then 2 side panels. That was at the cavalry unit in Albuquerque way back when. Then it got moved to the National Guard Armory here in Santa Fe, which was a New Deal building on Old Santa Fe Trail by the Methodist Church and CCA. And then they moved it out to the new building way out across from the racetrack. And they had it in a small conference room. And when they were doing all these moves, at one point or other, they took it out of the frame and stapled it to plywood and then drug it around as they took it from place to place. So when I got my hands on it, we ended up having to spend a lot of money because the whole bottom of this woven canvas had to be rewoven on the bottom. There was drips of white paint on it. That was because, when they were painting the walls around it, somebody messed up. And all in all of these things are now at least over 75 years old. And some of us at 75 don't look quite as good as we did at 13 or 20. So that's why a lot of this needs conservation, preservation, or restoration. I didn't know anything about those things until I got involved in this. And that's what we have been doing. We are now starting to look at some other projects that we're going to be doing. We could always use more money if anybody has a big check they want to write, and we'll take care of it. So look through here and see what I mentioned. And like I said, the book has a chapter on the Hispanic artist and what they did, the Native American artist and what they did. There's a chapter on the 400 WPA schools that were built in this state and what they are today, if I was able to find out. Some of them are still schools. Some of them are senior citizen centers, community centers. One's a church. 2 of them are homes. And they're all over the state. And so there's plenty. It's better than a AAA book to put in your car and go see New Mexico. But let's talk about, I've talked about Cassidy. Let's talk about Paul Lance. He's in the Santa Fe room, right?
Yeah, he's in the ballroom, he's in the lobby, corridor.
Yeah, right, right. He was born in, and you may have these facts already, but 1908 and died in 1998. My ears went up a couple of weeks ago when Pasatiempo had a story about an artist named Chris Lance, who has a show at a gallery here in town. And I will tell you what that is in a minute. So I wondered, that's interesting. Paul Lance had a son named Chris Lance. I wonder if it's the same guy. Well, he's 82 years old. Maybe not. Maybe not. By God, I call that gallery, and it is Paul Lance's son. And furthermore, Chris was born in the La Fonda Hotel. The marriage didn't last, and there was another marriage and 2 other children came along. But one of the stories, I don't know if you know about Paul, he had some work up at Madrid in the mines. And then the mines hired him, and this sounds pretty bizarre. They hired him to do drawings of the people that got killed in mine accidents because many of the people couldn't read and write. So they needed to have something that would show who this person was, besides they knew the person's name, of course. So he drew the bodies, images of the bodies, so that people would have something to identify who it was. That's an interesting challenge for an artist, right? After there was a divorce, Paul Lance moved to New York and to Kansas and San Francisco and Oregon and the East Coast, but he maintained homes here in Santa Fe and New York over the years. He illustrated 30 books and some magazine stories. He said he had to paint because if he didn't, he got fidgety. So it was a very important thing to him. He did portraits of Clyde and Carrie Tingley at Carrie Tingley Hospital, and I know right where those are, and that's in Albuquerque. He did a mural in Clovis, and it was in the post office, and I know this mural well. It was later became an architect's office, and now I think it's a church, and I keep trying to call them and find out, and I've got one detective in Clovis that's checking it out, that building may now be a church, but probably the mural is still there. The reason I get real tickled about this one is because I grew up in Portales, and Clovis and Portales were always, rivals. And the director of the Federal Art Project here grew up in a little town outside of Clovis, and he could never get anybody to let him do a mural or a painting or something in Clovis because Clovis were a bunch of snobs, and they thought those artists were queer. They were strange, and they didn't want to have any of those kind of people in their town. Portales had some of the same, but they weren't that bad. Anyway, Russell Vernon Hunter, the director, finally talked him into doing a mural in the post office, and Paul Lance got the job. He got the job done. It's a vision of a cowboy riding down the main street of Clovis on his horse. And the front page article the next day was, "See, those artists don't know nothing. That poor horse only has 3 legs," because he was galloping down, say, the main street and one leg was up. But they didn't account for that. So Paul Lance still has a painting and mural in Clovis. We just got to figure out what that building is today. I know where it is. He did also he lived in Springer and Phoenix. His brother, Walter, whom I know nothing about, except he was the guy that worked for Disney and created the cartoon Woody Woodpecker. There is a collective of some of his works in the CCC archives in the Smithsonian in Washington. So he must have been an interesting guy. I have been trying hard to get to meet Chris, and I understand from the gallery person that he lives in Rowe, he has no phone, and you get in touch with him through his daughter in Texas, And I have been trying to get her, and then she'll talk to him, and then maybe I'll get to talk to him. But his artwork, based on the pictures in the Pasatiempo, doesn't look anything like his dad's. Totally different. Now let's talk about a gal named E. Boyd. E. Boyd Hall. To the best of my knowledge, and I want you guys to be detectives about this, and maybe you've got it in your manual, she was the person who was hired to do and create the portfolio of Spanish colonial art. This was going to be part of the Index of American Design, and every state was asked to do some artwork that was typical of their state. Not all states did it. Texas did something that was illustrating the cattle brands that they had. E. Boyd selected the artwork of Spanish colonial work here in our state. She got permission from the Archbishop to go into the churches in northern New Mexico and draw images of of the saints in those churches. Now there had to be a little viejita sitting on one of the chairs in the church while she was doing it to make sure she was doing everything right, or that she didn't make off with something, or who knows, whatever. But that was in the writings about that the Archbishop required. So she did this portfolio. What she did was draw these images of various saints, they created 200 sets of 50 images. You can go to the city library and ask to see the portfolio of Spanish colonial design. Make sure they don't bring you this book, or a copy of this book, that they bring you the actual portfolio. When I do tours, I do try to take people in there and show you them. So they are, basically, she did the drawings, line drawings, then 6 people made woodcuts of those images, and then they printed them at El Rito and down in Clovis, and then they made all these copies, and they sent them out. They were black and white images about this big. They sent them out to artists and would-be artists in order to put people to work, and they sent them watercolors and what they were supposed to do here, and so it was a first paint-by-number job, I think. And you were called a copyist, and you made about $40 a month. And you would do your copies, and then the supervisor would come and get them and take them back and bring you some more. And one story was of a Protestant lady down on the east side, because there weren't many Catholics down there. When she handed one of hers out, she said, "I just finished painting 250,000 drops of Jesus on the cross." So she had done one of the crystals. Anyway, they sent them to Washington, and they didn't like them. They were too primitive. They were originals. And so they didn't get in the original Index of American Design. But guess what? I was there about 2-3 years ago, and they were at a show in the Library of Congress. And they were highly respected and really think they're wonderful. The person who put that together was a man named Holger Cahill. And if you've been around for a while and been into Albuquerque, his daughter lived in Albuquerque for many years. Her name was Jane Blumenfeld. Her husband was Art Blumenfeld at the university. And I'm in touch with her about an activity we're doing. She was a good friend of ours, started with us and was on our board to start with. But anyway, this is a special thing. This book was done by Paul Retz in Albuquerque and his wife Barb Awalt. And it turns out his grandfather was a New Deal person too. Okay, let's talk about E. Boyd. I talked to one of her husbands, Ed Hall. Somebody may know Ed. This was a few years ago. I think he's still alive. But he told me that she did the murals in the 2 entrances into the building. There's no signature on there. I have asked, before you were here, Ed, other people, and no, they didn't know.
You mean the ones coming in
On the
trail?
Old Santa Fe Trail and St. Francis side, San Francisco side. Who? Okay, I raised this question because somebody said to me one time, my mother did a mural, it's the entrance coming into La Fonda, and I've never been able to document it, so that's what I was going to throw out. Who did? We don't know. Okay, well, Ed Hall said she did it. I don't know. But I was going to raise that question to you because I would love to know who did it. Okay, there was another guy floating around Santa Fe, and you guys, for some reason, decided to build a room for him and name it the Lumpkins Room. Bill Lumpkins. Bill was supposedly, he always said, he was born at a ranch called Rabbit Ears up by Clayton. He was born in 1909. But Jennifer said, no, he was really born in Marlow, Oklahoma. So I haven't taken the time to find, but I'll bet you Marlow's not that far from Clayton. So that's why he was in the area. But then he also was down later in Capitan and also in Arizona. He was very good friends of Peter Hurd. Did everybody read the story about Peter Hurd in the New Mexico magazine? They made an error. They have an error in there. They said that they talk about Peter Hurd painting murals in Alamogordo in the 50s for the New Deal. Well, the 50s was a little late. It was 30s and 40s. And he did four really fine murals in the Alamogordo. What was the post office is now a county building. And if you're ever in Alamogordo, go find that building. It's right downtown. He studied architecture at UNM and also in California, and he finally finished up in 1934 in architecture. He didn't think his family could afford, well, he didn't think, he knew his family couldn't afford for him to go to college and become an artist, so he chose architecture. Then he got a job with the WPA and working in the vocational school, and that, to me, probably meant he was working probably in El Rito or working with programs in El Rito or Las Vegas or some of the little communities up in northern New Mexico. I haven't been able to find it again, but he did a booklet on drawing on furniture and how to make furniture, the Spanish design that we're familiar with. He then spent 3 months at that job, and then he also did some artwork. And look on the front of that book that you're holding, the ones of you who have the book in front of you. That is one of 3 paintings he did for the Federal Art Project, and that's Anglo Village, and the other two are Hispanic Village, and the other one Native American Village. And as most of you know, he went off in a little different direction the older he got and did what was called transcendental art. And I've never quite understood what that was, so I wrote down how I explained it in the book. It was the opportunity for artists to carry painting beyond the appearance of the physical world through new concepts of space, color, light, and design to imaginative realms that are idealistic and spiritual, whatever that means. But there was a lot of the guys that got into that, and 2 or 3 women, and they did these very abstract paintings. And in fact, Jennifer's mom once said to me she could not believe that Bill Lumpkins did that painting and the other 2 because she knew him when he was in his abstract period, and she hadn't seen anything that was realistic. Then he got into the architectural program of the WPA. The first architectural activity that was done in New Mexico by architects, but not Bill, was to survey Acoma Pueblo. Now, I'm telling you, they put everybody to work doing all kinds of things. And if you can imagine doing an architectural study of Acoma Pueblo, that was the first thing in New Mexico. The job that Bill got into and shared with me about, which was very important to me because I was very much involved with Carrie Tingley Hospital. Carrie Tingley was the wife of Clyde, our governor at that time. And as you know, Franklin Roosevelt had polio, and polio was on the rampage at that time in this country. So in New Mexico, and I'm sure other states, they were looking for places for polio hospitals. And they would go to places where there were hot springs. Does anybody remember we used to have a town named Hot Springs, which is now called Truth or Consequences. There's also hot springs up at Ojo Caliente. So comes time, and Clyde wants to make sure that he has a place for his polio kids to be treated. And the joke is that he didn't do it at Ojo Caliente because it was too close to Santa Fe, and he couldn't get away from Cary that being that close. So they built it in Hot Springs and named it after Carrie Tingley. So various architectural firms bid on it, and the firm that Bill was on with got the bid. Bill told me this story. He said, after a couple of weeks after we got the bid, Mrs. Tingley came to call and said, and I want to know how my poliomyelitis hospital is coming along. And Bill said, we all looked kind of sheepish and, because they hadn't done anything. Finally, somebody said, if the truth were known, we don't really know what a poliomyelitis hospital has to have in it. She said, oh, that's not a problem. Where's your phone? So they took her to the phone, and she dialed the number, and the woman answered at the other end, and she said, Eleanor, I have this question. And said, we have somebody who needs to build a poliomyelitis hospital in New Mexico. Oh, Eleanor says, oh, that's not a problem. I'll get the architect from the Warm Springs, Georgia hospital to just come right out there and help you guys out. And that's what happened. So I love to tell that story, that these two women, and you have to know who Eleanor was, Eleanor Roosevelt and Carrie Tingley worked it out for us to get the Carrie Tingley Hospital built with its hot springs. I was the executive director of that, or the manager of that facility for a period of time. I worked with those hospital people down there a lot, and I loved the place. Then we reached the point, no more polio, all these orthopedic problems that children were having, some very critical, and back surgeries were involved, and hearts were involved, and you couldn't do it down in Hot Springs or TRC. I almost got a divorce over that little activity because my husband was from TRC, and I was the lobbyist for a hospital to move it up to Albuquerque. And he said, you're going to take the economy away from my hometown. And I said, I'm sorry, but I want to take care of the kids from all over the state. So, indeed, we were able to move the hospital program to Albuquerque. And there are some 20 paintings, which I moved in my car, except for the pieces that were practically that, two that are practically that big. And we reestablished the hospital there. And it's a going concern. So then what was going to happen to that building down there? And Bruce King was governor at that time, and there were a variety of things that came out as to possibilities. But the bottom line, it became a veterans hospital, a veterans retirement home. And it's a beautiful setting for them. Here are these hot mineral pools that they can go in and enjoy and help with their arthritis problems. So it's a perfect fit. It's really good. You should go see it when you're driving through TRC. You got to go to the post office and see the post office mural because it was chosen as the best mural in any post office in New Mexico. It's pretty hilarious. And look in the index and look up Truth or Consequences and post offices and see a picture of that mural. But anyway, we've got Bill, and I think those are the only ones that I know of that were also New Deal artists that worked here in La Fonda. I would just share with you that we are always wanting to find things and you have a whole list. No, that's the thing I was going to do. Turn to page 175, and I'll wrap this up. There, for the next few pages, there are pictures. There are either etchings by Jean Kloss, a woman, her name was Eugenie Geneva Kloss. She thought that was an awful long name to put on a woman, and so she just went by Jean, Gene, which also tells you that she was trying to fake it out so that they would think she was a man. So she did 9 etchings, and those were reproduced and sent out all over the state to primarily schools, and some of the schools still have them, and some of them have disappeared. Lock these into your brain, and when you go to somebody's house for cocktails, kind of wander around their house and see if they might have one. Then there was a guy named B.J.O. Nordfeld, and he did 6 as opposed to her 9, and they're in the next pages. And, you can see I also have the list of where they were sent to, what schools. Santa Fe, I know Harrington had a set of the Kloss ones because I used to see them. I went over there because it's a block from my house. Maybe 2 years ago, they were gone. Nobody knows where they are. Those kinds of things happen, particularly those black and whites. There are most of those that have the etchings that have disappeared because they're small, they're black frame, they have on the bottom PWAP, Public Works of Art Program, and the year on a brass plaque. Or if that plaque isn't there anymore, there'll be 2 holes. I have found one of those frames in El Rito with a totally different poster inside of that frame. It's more current kind of poster. It's fun. I was talking to legislative wives and secretaries one time about 6, 7 years ago, and the secretary said to me, I think I've got one of those. I said, really? Where'd you get it? Well, it's the garage sale the school put on. I said, how much did you pay for it? $5. And I said, She said, when I go home this weekend, I'll check it out and I'll bring it up and you can look at it. It's been on exhibit in the state capitol now since then. We also, last June, did a unique thing. You may have seen that or heard about it. We had 98 people paint shovels. Why would they paint a shovel? The shovel was the thing that built everything in the New Deal. We sold all but 10 of them, and if you want to see those 7 of those 10, go eat at Joe's Diner or have a cup of coffee. June 24th, we're going to do a big symposium. We'd love to have you help us make it happen. We're bringing in a granddaughter. Did I talk about this already? That's what I was thinking of. I've already told you this. Okay, we're going to be bringing in some named people. Most of those grandchildren have done equally very interesting things with their lives. So we'll be bringing these people in, having a symposium, and they're giving out 6 awards, presidential awards of the preservation for our organization. Don't tell her, but Nancy Meem is going to be one of the winners of the award. Nancy Worth, Peter Worth's mother, and John Meem's daughter. We hope to get a lot of press and a lot of people here for that, considering we're going to have all those people that represented that era. They didn't, but their families did, their family members. I'm sorry, but now I would very much like for you to fill out the back pages, anything that you might know that you could share with us. As I said, I would like you to become detectives, see if you can find. And actually, I know of about 3 or 4 other things besides those Kloss and B.J.O. Nordfeld that are missing. There's another portfolio of rugs that were done by Louis Ewing and Eliseo Rodriguez, and you can see those in various places. But there was one other portfolio was done by a woman named Ruth Conley with only one L. The Albuquerque Museum is trying to find something about Ruth Conley. I have a little block print that I bought at a garage sale. Sheldon Parsons did 2 good-sized paintings. One was called View near Ottawa, and the other one was View near near San Ildefonso. I started looking for them because, you know, the health department changed its names and changed buildings. There's only one of the 2 that they still have. We don't know where the others. And they're good size. They're, if you turned that one sideways, they would be twice that size. And they're views of landscapes. Sheldon Parsons, you're probably familiar with what his landscapes look like. Go find it. We want it back. I don't know where. They found the one in a closet. So these things can get lost in the buildings. They get taken home by somebody because it's been in his office all these years. And when he retired, he just took everything from his office home, including the paintings. They're public domain. They belong to you and me. They cannot be sold on eBay or Antique Roadshow. They belong generally to, well, they belong to us, but they're either General Services Administration or the post office. I got a call yesterday from Colorado Springs. There were 2 murals done for the post office in Colorado Springs. And a muralist was saying that they were in the post office, then they got moved to Washington, D.C., then one of them got moved back and put it in a federal building in Colorado Springs. He wants to get the other one back and get it, and he wanted me to help him figure out how to get it back. I looked at my list of all the post office murals, and the post office said those 2 murals were lost. Now that list was a few years ago, so maybe they now know that they have one in Washington, maybe they don't. I'm going to call them and ask them because I have a good contact there. But I get calls like that every week, and it's so much fun, and it's a sleuthing thing to go and see what you can find out. So I encourage you to go sleuthing and find these things that belong to you and go and see them. They're all around you, whether you go to a state park or whether you go to a post office or whether you go to the school that you grew up in or the library that you were at. They're all around you. And most people, including me, don't see them. But they're beautiful. And I hope you will enjoy them and help me preserve them. So thank you very much.